Someone has been mailing me recordings of myself. The first one was a couple of weeks ago. It was just an unmarked DVD in a paper sleeve, addressed to me without a return address. I figured it was some kind of spam mail and I tossed it out. Ain't nobody got time for that, am I right? The second one was getting ready to romance the trash as well, but it happened to arrive the same day I bought a used Xbox. I wanted to test out the DVD player and I didn't have anything else handy, so I just popped it in and let it play. The footage was a bit fuzzy and shaky, like someone was walking while they recorded. It showed me entering my apartment building, following me until I got to the elevator. I even looked right at the camera for a split second, but racking my brain, I couldn't remember noticing anyone strange. There was a voice over the footage as well, but it was in German and I couldn't make any sense of it. I started it over and watched again, only about 15 seconds. It wasn't so much creepy as surreal. I was honestly more bothered about how terrible my posture looked than I was about someone actually recording me. Probably just some kid showing off his new camera or something. The world is full of weirdos, am I right? The third one rattled me, though. The video showed me in the grocery store, wandering up and down the aisle looking for something. About 10 seconds again, more German voiceover. This wasn't someone innocently playing with their phone in the lobby anymore. I was being actively followed. I immediately threw the disc away, then regretted it and dug it out of the trash a couple minutes later. I had to get this translated so I could figure out what the hell was going on. The next day, I shuffled through my mail like crazy looking for another DVD. Nothing came. Or the next day. Or the day after that. Getting it translated fell further and further down my to-do list. Until a week or so later, I had practically forgotten about it. Until yesterday, anyway. When another paper sleeve slipped out from between some junk mail and landed on my floor. I rushed to play it, regretting it from the very first frame. The screen was panning around my room. My bedroom. It was dark, but everything had a green night vision tint to it. The camera then focused on the bed and started to approach it. It took me a few seconds to realize the lump in the dark. It was recording me while I slept. Then, a hand reached out from behind the camera. Pale, thin, hairless, with skin stretched too tight across the bones. And the digits on the hand were all wrong. 4 to each finger, and each double-jointed, moving so fluidly they might as well have been tentacles. It rested a long finger on my forehead, trailing down my nose, over my lips, brushing so softly that I couldn't even tell whether it was touching at all. Then I heard a voice, something in German again, a sing-song voice barely above a whisper. It was longer this time, but I paused to keep going back until I could write down every word as close as I could hear it. I watched the rest of the video before I translated anything. Whoever was recording me stayed beside me for a very long time. But I didn't want to fast forward because I was afraid of missing some crucial dialogue. I stared at it, staring at me for almost an hour, before I couldn't take it anymore. The camera had been still for a long time, and I hadn't seen or heard any other sign of the perpetrator. I decided even if something else did happen that night, then I'd prefer not to know. I rummaged around my things until I found the elevator and the grocery store tapes too, writing down all the German from them to translate. After typing my way through the spellings a few times, Google Translate gave me this. Tape 1. Don't know, I threw it out before I ever knew what it was. Tape 2. This one was me in the elevator. Look at him go. I can't believe he's going back into the apartment after what we told him last time. Tape 3. This one was me at the grocery store. Found him again. Look how calm he is. Just going about his life. Do you think he's seen it yet? Tape 4. This was whispered while I slept. Sleep, baby, sleep. Thy father guards the sheep. Thy mother shakes the little trees. There falls down one little dream. Sleep, baby, sleep. The sky draws the sheep. The little stars are little lambs. The moon, the little shepherd. Sleep, baby, sleep. I shall bring your sheep, one with a golden bell, that shall be thy journeyman, to guide you safe to hell. That's it. I don't know whether this thing is trying to threaten me or protect me, or what it could be trying to protect me from. Either way, I don't think I'm going to sleep tonight. I don't know what I would do if I woke up and I saw that thing watching me, recording me, even touching me with its long, disjointed fingers. When the next DVD comes, if it comes, I don't think I'll have the stomach to watch it. Yes, I can see people's auras. And I hate saying it so bluntly. It makes me sound like some hack psychic who fakes the ability as a means of exploitation and a paycheck. I've never made any money from my ability. I've never taken advantage of it. And until now, I've never spoken of it to anybody. But I really do see them. And I'm starting to view it as more of a curse. I have a reason for typing this out, and I assure you, there isn't a happy ending to this story. For me, it's quite simple. I see a faint light surrounding people. Everyone. And in that light, I can see their morality. The brighter and more translucent the light is, the better the person. The darker and opaquer, the worse. Dim and partly translucent are morally ambiguous. To simplify things, those are the three ways I describe them. Dark equals evil, bright equals good, dim equals somewhere in between. It's strange. I've always viewed the people with dim/gray auras as arbiters, mediators, the people in between, who aren't one or the other, and will always have difficult decisions to make. I was a child when I first became aware of my gift. It didn't take too long to figure out that the brighter auras were kinder to me and selfless. While both my parents are good people, my father's aura was quite a bit brighter than my mother's. As a result, he was always far more patient and understanding with me. It was clear to see that my teachers and fellow students with brighter auras were usually friendlier and more compassionate. The dark auras were the stereotypical fighters, lunch money stealers, and bullies. I would say I was around 8 years old when I fully figured out that I have a gift that most people don't have, that possibly nobody else has. I've read some of the New Age websites and alternative medicine articles that give their take on aura reading. While I believe that the vast majority of it is bullshit, I expect there must be at least some other people out there with my ability. So I don't want to completely dismiss those people as an outright hoax. It's just that, for me, it doesn't work anything like the way those websites describe. I visited numerous aura readers and psychics. Most of them have dim or dark auras themselves, and I'm certain they don't really hold this power. I'm not saying all psychics are terrible people, no, of course not. I've visited a few who had relatively bright auras. They were unable to convince me that they really have psychic powers, but they, at the very least, use their deception to try and help people. You need to understand. I'm going to end this entry by sharing a terrifying event that is happening to me. But before I get to that, I think there are a few more things I need to explain. I imagine many of you are curious as to what type of aura is the most common. I'm happy to tell you that the majority of people are somewhere between dim and bright. I see very few dark auras. This isn't scientific, and I haven't traveled the world plotting out charts and graphs and whatnot, but I'd estimate around 60% of the people are bright-ish. Around 25% are dim-ish, leaving just around 15% darkish. Once again, these are just estimates. What's the precise difference between, say, bright and dim? I have no idea. But rest assured, there are far more bright in the world than dark. The next thing I'd like to discuss is children. I can see a person's aura right from birth, and I've never encountered an aura changing as someone ages. I'm not sure what this means for the whole nature versus nurturer debate. And I'm not saying that everyone with a dark aura always behaves terribly, or vice versa. A person with a bright aura might be born in horrible conditions, acquire a drug problem, and then resort to thievery to feed their addiction. Personally, I think the difference is this. A bright aura thief with a horrible upbringing may rob someone, but they would never intentionally hurt someone in the process. A dark aura thief, however, would kill someone if they could get away with it, without even a second thought. Another interesting note. I find the ratio between bright, dim, and dark to be similar across pretty much all human activities. Whether I'm at a church or at a death metal concert, it always seems to be around the same 60, 25, 15% ratio. I once visited a federal prison and was shocked to see that at least half of the prisoners there had bright auras. I had to be at the prison in person to see this because I can't see auras on photographs, television shows, movies, or even in mirrors. I can only see auras in the real world. Another strange thing is I can't even see my own aura. I assume and hope I would be on the brighter spectrum, but I just can't see it. The brightest person I ever saw worked as a social worker. She shone so bright that it was difficult for me to even look directly at her. Based on the way people acted in her presence, I think that almost everyone around her could sense her brightness in a subconscious way. Everyone loved her. She had donated a kidney to someone she barely even knew. She had a special needs adopted child. Most of the money she earned was donated to various charities, and that's only the little that I knew of her. This woman shined so brightly that she scared me. I know it may sound strange, but it was scary to me that someone could be this good. But it wasn't nearly as scary as the darkest person I ever saw. I was 20 years old at the time, leaving a club downtown at 2 a.m. A man walked quietly down the street. I didn't see him at first, but I noticed a light dimming around me. This man was so dark that he partly absorbed the light around him. I looked at him long and hard. He looked desperate, cruel, and callous. When he looked up and locked eyes with me, it almost made me fall back. He smirked almost as though he knew what I could see. I saw his face up close. I would never forget it. And I recognized it when I saw his mugshot a few weeks later in the newspaper. He had murdered his ex-wife and 2 children in cold blood. I think I need to get to it now. The main reason why I'm writing this out. I fell in love a year ago. She didn't shine anywhere near as bright as what I had seen before, but she most assuredly wasn't dark or even dim. She was beautiful. Her sense of humor, her wit, well, everything. She was my dream woman, and I never told her anything at all about the auras I see. I could go into far more detail about her, but this isn't a love story. What's important is this. We fell in love, she got pregnant, we got married, we were happy. We were so happy. I remember hearing the buzz of my phone 2 mornings ago. I remember my excitement when I saw it's happening. Come to the hospital. I remember my frustration when I got stuck in traffic. I remember how long it took for me to find a parking spot. I remember shouting at the nurse, "What room is my wife in?" I remember bursting through the door and seeing the smile on my wife's face. I remember seeing the doctor, his light shining so bright, as he told me, "Congratulations, it's a boy." The doctor held him up to me, and all the light in the room dissipated. "No, this isn't right," I remember saying. The doctor put him in my arms. The darkness around my son was so absolute that I could barely even see him. He was a void in my arms. He was so dark that the world barely even existed around him. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. I found myself starting to weep. I think my wife and the doctor thought they were tears of joy, but they most definitely weren't. Lord knows they weren't. I think back to the dark outline around that man that murdered his family. It was, up to that point, the darkest I had ever seen. But the darkness around my son was 100 times worse. 1,000 times worse. And what could possibly be 1,000 times worse than murdering your entire family? It's been 2 days. We're home now. My son's darkness is so extreme that it dims the hallway leading up to his room. My wife, she knows something is very wrong. I think she suspects that I'm having regrets about having children at all. If only she knew. What do I do? He's my son. Just 20 minutes ago, I stood above him, holding a pillow over his face. But I couldn't do it. Not yet, anyway. A man who could murder his 2-day-old baby boy. What color would his aura be? And here's the thought that just keeps going through my mind as I sit here alone. The fathers of our worst. The Adolf Hitlers. The Joseph Stalins. Timothy McVeighs. If their fathers knew what they would become, would they murder them in the cradle? Would they have the strength to hold the pillow down as long as it takes? I can see the door to my son's room from my office. The hallway seems to be growing darker. I look down at my hands as I type this. Maybe I'm going crazy, but there seems to be an aura around my hands and arms now. It's gray. It's dim. Maybe it's always been dim. I'm looking down at the pillow beside me. The grayish dim outline around my hands more apparent than ever. Maybe it's time. Maybe this is why I have this gift. It all comes down to right now. I have a very difficult decision to make. But maybe it's time. I think it's time. I always thought it was strange that so many people had such an irrational fear of clowns. When I was a little boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, my parents took me to the circus. I have nothing but fond memories of that day. When I first stepped out of the vehicle, the very first thing I experienced was the scent of the circus. The sweetness of funnel cakes and cotton candy wafted all the way out into the parking lot. The underlying scent of the animal cages were a mere footnote to the smell of hot dogs and popcorn. The next thing to bombard my senses were the sounds. Shrieks of adults that were lifted high into the sky by one of the giant mechanical attractions echoed throughout the whole area. The high-pitched squeals of children as they ran around from tent to tent. The sounds of games being played and a chorus of circus-goers chatting. All of that supplanted by the faint sound of circus music being played from the loudspeakers. When we entered through the large metal gates, I had a strange feeling come over me. The gates themselves felt less like they were trying to keep people out than they were to keep people in. Once I was finally within the grounds, I experienced a total sensory overload. The lights, the sounds, the smells, each hitting me in wave after wave. My child-sized brain almost couldn't keep up with everything, let alone make decisions on what to do first. I ran from one stand to the next, browsing each of their wares. And that's when I saw it. In the distance was a stand, decorated with so many toys you could barely see the attendant standing inside of it. With a stern yet welcoming tone, the man called out, "Ladies and gentlemen, step right up. Hurry, hurry. Every try wins a prize." I'm unsure what compelled me to take off like I did, but I quickly found myself sprinting towards the man standing in the booth, while my parents lingered behind me. Just as I was closing the distance between me and Toy Nirvana, I tripped. The taste of gravel and wood chips rubbed on my lips as my body slid into the ground. It took a moment for the white-hot pain to shoot throughout my body. I was on the verge of tears when I heard another voice. This voice was in the fashion of a cartoon character. He spoke in a weird tone with odd inflections. To be completely honest, I wasn't sure if I was truly hearing a person speak or a machine of some sort. This new voice spoke aloud to me.
Uh-oh. Looks like someone had too much cotton candy.
Just then, my eyes adjusted and I could see a white-gloved hand outstretched in front of my face. I grabbed the hand, not thinking twice, and was hoisted into the air and set back onto my feet. When I could finally focus on my surroundings, I looked up at him. Standing before me was a very tall man, who appeared to have fallen into a rainbow. His face was pale like fresh cement. Around his mouth was red like he had just eaten an entire case of popsicles. His colorful hair shot out from the top of his head like he had just been struck by lightning. While this man was certainly odd and different, I honestly didn't feel threatened by him. He knelt down on one knee and spoke to me once again.
"Are you okay, little boy?"
he said in an almost mocking tone. "Yes," I said, wiping some of the leftover gravel from my face.
"I'll tell you what. For being such a good little boy, you deserve a balloon,"
he exclaimed. He quickly stood up and twirled in place. When he turned back to face me, he had with him a single red balloon. He probably just grabbed it off of one of the stands next to us. But at the time, and to me, it seemed like magic. He handed me the balloon and gave off an enormous chuckle.
"Here you go."
During this time, my parents had both ran up to me to make sure I was all right. When they stood next to me, I thought I saw the clown in front of me frown. It's a strange thing to see someone with a painted smile frown. My parents both thanked the clown for looking after me, but he didn't say a single word to them. He just kind of awkwardly stared at them. They once again thanked him and told me it was time to go home. Just as we were turning to leave, I heard the clown once more.
Wait just a minute. I have something for you,
he said to me as I quickly spun back around. When I saw him, his once previously empty hands now contained a teddy bear, which was roughly the size of my small child-sized frame. He knelt down, handing me the bear, and said one last thing to me.
I hope you come back to see us again real soon, Matthew.
With that, my parents ushered me from the circus grounds and back into the car. The whole drive home, I couldn't help but stare at the red balloon and the stuffed animal, and wonder how the clown had known my name. It surely added weight to the magic thought I had earlier. After arriving home and getting ready for bed, my mother tucked me in and told me goodnight, before turning off my light and shutting my door. I was filled with thoughts of the circus, and what I had experienced as I stared at my new teddy bear. Then I heard a sound, like a faint whisper coming from somewhere in my room.
Matthew,
it said. When I first heard it, I thought perhaps my father had come back into my room to wish me goodnight as well, but I had seen my door was still shut. I'm not sure exactly why, but when I noticed that my door was still closed, is when I began to feel unnerved. I began to feel as though I were trapped in my own room with this voice.
Matthew.
I heard it once again, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. As I gazed around my room is when I saw it. A white, gloved hand protruding from my closet door. Fear slowly started to settle in as I watched the hand gesture for me to come over. I remained in my bed, not because of logic, but because I was unable to move. I barely managed to pull the blanket up over my head in some sort of instinctual self-preservation. An hour went by and I didn't hear so much as a squeak. I thought that the whole ordeal was just my mind making things up. I pulled the covers down and stared at the closet door. It was completely shut, with no ghostly hand sticking out of it. I felt my body begin to relax. Just as I was succumbing to exhaustion, I heard another whisper.
Matthew.
Only this time, the sound was coming from underneath my bed. I felt my heart thrash in my chest when I heard it. My breath quickened and I felt sweat bead on my head. I don't know why I decided to look over the edge of my bed. When I peered over the edge, I saw him. That clown from before. His head was sticking out from underneath my bed. His makeup was smudged and his previously happy demeanor was non-existent. He stared at me with wide, vacant eyes, as if we were locked in a twisted staring contest. Suddenly, his hand shot out from underneath my bed and grabbed a hold of my face. I screamed so loud that my voice shattered a few seconds later, leaving me with only a hoarse, wheezing sound. I fought against his hand, trying desperately to get it off of me. The farther I lurched back to try and get away from his hand, the longer his arm became. It was like a tentacle with fingers. Tears began to soak my cheek as he began to pull me towards the floor. He was trying to drag me underneath the bed. With all my attempts to struggle proving ineffective, I did the only thing my childish mind could think of at that moment. I bit down on one of his fingers as hard as I could. This didn't even seem to faze him as he simply pulled harder. I finally lost my grip on the edge of my bed and fell to the floor with a sharp thud. Through the tears in his hand, I could just barely see underneath my small twin-sized bed. There seemed to be a black void that his arm was coming out of. I kicked and punched at the arm with all my might, but it was hopeless. Just before I was dragged into the blackness, The light in my room turned on and my parents were standing in the doorway. I looked around and the arm was gone. I crumbled into a pile of tears and shallow breaths. My parents, concerned, asked me what had happened, and I told them everything. But they just said I ate way too much candy and had a nightmare. They let me sleep in their bed for the rest of the night. The following day after the incident, I worked up the courage to check underneath my bed. Sitting there, as if it were still trying to reach out for me, was a single white glove. I always thought it was strange that so many people had an irrational fear of clowns. I now know that I'm one of them. And it's most definitely not irrational. I'm not a doomsday prepper. I'm really not. I prefer the phrase understandably cautious. I don't build bunkers or escape routes or any of that nonsense. I just have bars on my windows and barricades over my doors. Not nearly as crazy, right? And maybe a few security cameras and motion sensors. But nothing in the bedrooms or in the bathrooms. That would just be weird. And the fact that my windows are additionally reinforced with shatterproof glass is an eco-friendly coincidence. It came with the window insulation upgrade package. In short, it's not that I'm preparing for the apocalypse. I just want to feel secure in my own home. Nobody enters or leaves without my knowledge. Do you know the peace of mind that can give? I've never slept more soundly in my life. So when my phone alerted me to movement right outside my back door at 2 a.m., I didn't panic. I casually flipped through my security camera footage until I found the dark, grainy feed. Some nondescript guy in a gray hoodie and a mask, brushing up against my door, presumably looking for a way inside. Good luck with that. That door, like all doors in my house, has a reinforced steel interior, a 1.5-inch deadbolt, and hinges that would only give way to a charging rhino. And after that, my mystery housebreaker would still have to deal with the steel bars across the frame that I lower into place each evening. I idly snapped a few screenshots, my attention already drifting back to my game. An unexpected movement caught my eye as I started to turn away, however. The housebreaker was shrinking, folding. I looked closer. Tiny red tendrils, almost invisible through my security camera, were snaking their way out of the hoodie and towards the door, clinging to it like vines. The figure slouched over as increasingly more tendrils left his body, until the door was covered in a thin spread mass of viscera, veins, and then a pile of clothes sat abandoned on my back porch. I watched in horror as the fleshy tendrils seemed to melt into the door, and quickly switched to my hallway camera. Yes, there it was, on the other side of the door. Questioning tendrils joined a half-formed mass of a person, growing with each passing second. Before long, a figure stood in my hallway. It took one cautious, slow step, and then another, and then another. With increasing confidence, it stumbled towards the stairs to the second floor. The stairs to my bedroom. I suddenly feel much less secure in my own home. And the bars on my bedroom window aren't budging an inch, no matter how hard I pull on them. I used to work as a pizza delivery guy in Detroit for a few years. I'm not going to tell you what part of the city I used to live in or the name of the pizza chain that employed me. It's not important, and besides, it has absolutely no bearing on the story I'm about to tell. The neighborhoods I used to work in were fairly safe, but sometimes I was sent to areas that had been truly devastated by the recession. If you've ever visited Detroit or done a Google image search on urban blight, you know what I'm talking about. The incident occurred late in the fall a few years ago, and the memory of it will stay with me until the day I die. It doesn't matter how hard I try to suppress it, or force it out of my consciousness. It always seems to float back up to the surface, like a dead fish, and it lets me know that it's still a part of me. It was a Thursday evening. It had been a hectic shift and I was making the last delivery for the night. The order was going to a residence in one of the less savory parts of town. That didn't really shock me. It was to be expected every now and again. Even folks in rough areas order pizzas and have cell phones. But I have to admit, I wasn't too thrilled about the possibility of getting mugged or shot. Any half-decent car in the poor section of town is pretty much fair game to the local gangs. And believe me, there are plenty of those in Detroit. The house was just a tiny little fibro shack on a big corner block. There were no lights on inside, and for a brief moment I prayed that I had the wrong address. But a quick look at the mailbox out front squashed my hopes of a safe getaway. I cursed silently as I gazed out over the desolate property. The moon was out and that made it even creepier. I could see the grass on the lawn was knee-high and there was debris everywhere. The windows on the house were boarded up with plywood and were adorned with graffiti and bullet holes. Needless to say, I had a very bad feeling about what was about to happen. And if it had been up to me, I would have just kept on driving. But that was out of the question. I couldn't afford to lose my job, and career opportunities weren't exactly growing on trees in this city. So I stayed where I was. I took a few deep breaths to try and calm myself and said a quick prayer. Then I grabbed the pizza boxes and reached for a Coke Zero next to me in the passenger seat. Then I found myself walking up to the house. The cold evening air gushing through the area was racing in and out of my lungs like pistons in a car engine. The gravel made loud crunching noises every time I put my feet down. And I kept looking around nervously, convinced that some psycho was going to jump me at any second. But no one came. I was alone. As I climbed the concrete stoop leading up to the porch, I noticed the front door was ajar, and I stopped dead in my tracks and I just stared at it. For some strange reason, this really unnerved me, and I could feel my heart starting to race faster. A voice inside my head kept telling me to get the hell out of there, and I have to admit, I seriously entertained the idea of just leaving the pizza on the porch and taking off, but I knew that I couldn't. I had to follow protocol. Leaving food outside of a residence was a fireable offense. So I walked the rest of the way up to the door and gave it a quick knock. The force of my fist striking the old timber made it move, and a loud guttural sound escaped from somewhere deep inside me as the squeaky hinges gave off a high-pitched wail. But no one came to the door. I swallowed hard, braced myself, and put my knuckles up to the door again. And this time I called out the words, "Your pizza's here," into the dark. But still there was no answer, and I foolishly believed I was off the hook. Then, as I was about to turn around and leave, a faint, cold, raspy voice coming from somewhere deep in the house told me to enter. I stood absolutely still, staring at the gap in the door with my eyes that were ready to pop out of their sockets. And for a brief second, I started wondering if I had just imagined it. But then the voice called out again. And this time it kept repeating the words over and over, like it was a recording. It had a menacing quality to it, and my whole body started shaking. And that's when I made up my mind.
I threw the pizzas down, not really giving a damn about whether I had a job to go to the next day or not. And then I ran. I jumped from the top of the stoop and ran like a lunatic down the driveway back to my car, and almost ripped the door off its hinges as I threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a good 10 seconds just to get the engine started. Then I raced out of the neighborhood as fast as I could. Maybe it was the effect of the adrenaline wearing off, or maybe it was just a delayed reaction. But when I opened the door and got out of my car, I threw up. But at least I was alive. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, I woke up to someone banging on my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers greeted me with stony expressions. After asking me a few questions, one of them took a step forward, looked me straight in the eyes, and informed me that 2 pizza delivery guys had been found dead inside the house that I had ran away from the previous evening. Both of them had been found hanging by their neck. He then pulled out a picture from the inside pocket of his jacket and handed it to me. He gave me a few seconds to study it, and then he told me that they had found the picture taped to one of the bodies. The picture contained 3 faces. 2 of them had big red X's drawn across them. The last one didn't. The last face was mine. I nervously managed to look up to the officer and shake my head. The police officers thanked me for answering their questions and left. The next day, I left Detroit, and I've never gone back since. But even now, after all this time, I always look over my shoulder when I'm out and about. I'm also pedantic about staying indoors after dark. And I always make sure my doors and windows are locked. Whoever killed those delivery drivers in Detroit was never caught. And as long as he's out there, I'll be on my guard. And why shouldn't I be? He obviously knows who I am. But hopefully he doesn't know where I live. This is probably going to sound fake, but ever since I suffered a concussion last summer, I've been hearing a live studio audience around me 24/7. The doctors reassured me that they were merely auditory hallucinations brought on by the bump to my noggin, and that they'd eventually go away on their own once my brain healed. It was actually kind of funny at first. I mean, once I got over the initial shock and fear of hearing the unsolicited reactions of a bunch of strangers. They started off more entertaining than disturbing. But that balance eventually shifted, and I'm afraid of them now. The first time it happened was the day I was discharged from the hospital. It was a beautiful August day, and I was psyched to finally go out into the warm sun. Erin, my girlfriend, picked me up from the hospital to take me back to our apartment. I was in pretty high spirits, despite a persistent headache, which had followed me since the bike accident. Kids, wear your helmets. Erin made a joke, and suddenly, a flurry of hysterical laughter came flooding in from every corner of the car. I screamed at Erin to turn off the radio, covering my ears to drown out the noise, but the laughter only got louder. I could tell by the freaked out look in Erin's eyes that she hadn't been playing a practical joke on me. Once the chuckles subsided, I explained what had happened. Erin immediately turned the car around and drove me straight back to the medical facility. A brain scan and a few blood tests, and countless hours later, the doctors assured me it was just a harmless side effect of the concussion, and not a case of sudden onset schizophrenia, as I had feared. It was perfectly normal, they told me. Well, as normal as hearing a room full of easily entertained spectators could be. They told me to just go home and get some rest. It took me a few days to adjust to the auditory hallucinations, but I eventually started to see the humor in my predicament. Meetings at work were a lot more entertaining, what with the peanut gallery projecting annoyed groans whenever my boss slipped into a boring tangent. I didn't even have to secretly roll my eyes. The voices in my head were the perfect vessel through which I could express my innermost feelings without getting in trouble. At home, my captive audience laughed at every one of my jokes, even when Aaron failed to react to the punchline. When I went to bed, they'd awe as I wrapped my arms around Aaron, and again when my cat curled up between us for warmth. The voices even became a sort of early detection system, warning me of unseen dangers through a series of suspenseful gasps. It started going downhill about 2 months ago, when I was taking a shower alone in my apartment. Aaron was out of town that night, and I had this lingering fear that I had forgotten to lock the front door. As I was pouring shampoo into the palm of my hand, I heard the studio audience gasp in fear. It startled me enough that I spilled the hair cleansing product near my feet. My spectators continued to breathe in a stressed manner that suggested I was about to get attacked by a psycho-murdering home invader. I could feel myself tense up as I stood there naked and unprotected. Thinking I heard footsteps, I took a step back and slipped on the small puddle of shampoo. I remember feeling my feet flying towards the air while my upper body swung towards the floor. With a sharp pain to the side of my head, everything went black. By the time I came to, the water was running cold. I called my dad and he took me to the hospital. I was rewarded with 9 stitches to the temple. It's amazing what peer pressure can make you do even when your peers don't actually exist. In a matter of weeks, my captive audience managed to completely disrupt my life. After the shower incident, it was as though they were no longer on my side. One morning, I was crossing the street when I heard them gasp. I stopped, thinking a car was heading my way. Fortunately, the street was empty. Unfortunately, my rapid stop caused me to slip on the ice and break my wrist. They laughed. Several days later, I had an important marketing presentation at work. The studio audience kept making disapproving noises, sometimes even booing me mid-presentation. I got so tongue-tied that I messed up the whole sales pitch. The worst was what they did to my relationship with Aaron. Whenever we fought, the audience conveyed to me through groans that Aaron was a complete bitch. I'm not even sure what our last fight was about. I think it started with asking her to close the laundry room door. It was such an insignificant little fight, but made worse by the advice and reactions of a bunch of imaginary strangers. They made me doubt my feelings for her, until I finally cut her loose, much to their delight. My relationship with my parents and friends devolved in a similar manner. It was shocking for me to hear what my subconscious mind actually thought about the people that had surrounded me all my life. After a few more incidents at work, my boss fired me. I was left without loved ones, friends, or even a job. I felt so isolated, despite being accompanied at all times by the voices in my head. Alone in my living room, I drunk dialed my ex, and she came over to cheer me up. We got back together that night, and it was wonderful. Everything went back to normal after Aaron and I rekindled our flame. I still heard the constant and distracting laugh track, but I tried my hardest to ignore them. I was happy again, and slowly but surely I mended every bond I had broken. I even got my old job back. Apparently, my boss couldn't handle the workload without me, or so I've been told. For a while, all was right with the world, until one dreadful night. I was half asleep when I heard a knock at the door. I peeked through the window only to find a police car in the driveway. My heart stopped, and my faithful audience oohed. I opened the door. But of all the things the police told me, all I remember was hearing this. "I'm sorry, sir. There's been an accident." The studio audience roared with laughter and applause. Aaron had died. My heart broke, but my spectators continued chuckling wildly. When Aaron's casket was lowered into her grave, they laughed even harder. Tears streamed down the sides of my face, but they did not stop giggling and snickering the whole time. I must be some kind of sick monster because I can't keep them from laughing whenever I think of her. No matter what I do, I just can't seem to get them to stop. It wasn't long ago I noticed a strange noise coming from the air conditioning unit in the wall of the living room. At first, it was almost imperceptible from the other noises such a device would typically make. It started out as a slight clanking sound, only when it was first turned on. I had just accredited it to the age of the apartments and the appliances within. Realistically, they weren't all that old in the grand scheme of things, but without constant upkeep, things tend to break down and fall apart relatively fast. Everything in the place made at least some kind of noise. The washing machine shook, the dishwasher sounded like a jet taking off, and the fridge would kick on every few minutes and hum so loudly I'd have to turn the television up to hear anything over it. So you can see how it wasn't such a big deal for the air conditioner to rattle a little. So I put it to the back of my mind as just something that comes with age. That was until it started making the noise more and more often. I first noticed it when I turned it on and the rattling didn't just go away after a second or two. I had better tell the landlord so maintenance can come fix this, I thought. After about a minute, it once again stopped and the thought faded into memory. A few weeks passed and I began to notice other strange occurrences. Scratching in the walls, the electricity flickering in and out, the occasional thump in the night. Once again, things that could all happen due to the age of the wiring. Maybe a mouse had gotten into the walls or a noisy new neighbor had moved in. All pretty explainable, I thought. Besides, I worked a lot and really didn't have a lot of free time to do much, so it didn't bother me. But when things started to go missing in my tiny one-bedroom apartment, I started to worry. I hadn't been home in what felt like a couple of weeks. Between work and friends, I was barely there at all besides to sleep and bathe. I figured I should do a thorough search of the place and see where my things could have gone. The TV remote, a calculator, several pairs of socks, and one shoe were all apparently misplaced. So I went through, room to room, which was really only 4 rooms, searched high and low to find my things, and as I did this, I noticed more and more small, ineffectual things were also missing. Strange, I thought. Where could these things have gone? I hit the power button on the TV and sat down in my once familiar armchair, now a stranger in my own forgotten home, and noticed something. The TV wasn't on. I flipped the light switch up and down, but nothing. Oh, for God's sakes, this is getting a little ridiculous. I got up and twisted the knob on the stereo. Nothing. I went around and tested all the appliances to see if they were all still functioning. To no avail, as not a thing in the place was still functioning except, strangely enough, the increasingly loud air conditioner. It came on with a loud rattle and ran that way for several minutes until it sparked. I heard a loud pop, and then it too died. Maybe the power's out and it'll be fine in the morning, I thought half-heartedly. I had a hard time sleeping that night. The neighbors were especially loud, and being without power made me nervous. I woke up the next morning to find that the power was still out. I took a shower, got dressed, and went over to my neighbors to ask if they were having similar problems. I knocked loudly several times, but no answer. I decided enough was enough and went to the maintenance office to complain and hopefully resolve this issue. When I opened the door, the smell of stale smoke swept into my nostrils. The place was a mess. Papers and ashes all about the desk. Peeling paint. Smudges on the windows. And a TV with only static bolted to the wall. Sitting behind the desk was a thin, graying man who looked as if he hadn't bathed in a week. I told him about how everything was suddenly not working but the AC unit, until it too sputtered its last. He gave me a sarcastic look, and with a gruff, he grabbed his toolbox and followed me back to my apartment. You see, I would have called, but for some reason nothing seems to be working. And I don't think the electricity is out because the air conditioner was running and it suddenly died.
Well, let's take a look at it,
he said. He went over to it and unscrewed the faceplate and peered inside. He clicked his flashlight on and went to work unscrewing and checking different things when he stopped suddenly and pulled out a tiny little object attached to a cord that didn't look like it belonged. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow.
This yours?
I couldn't even identify what he was holding. I don't believe so. What is it?
It's one of those little spy cameras. You haven't been having any girls over, secretly taping them, have you?
He said with a sly grin. What? No. What the hell was that doing in my apartment? I was getting worried and a little irate. He shrugged.
Well, let's see where this wire goes, huh?
He followed the wire with his hand and stopped to look inside.
A little hole goes into the wall.
He pulled out his hammer and got to work taking chunks out of the drywall and following the cord. I was freaking out at that point. Who put that there? Was this dirty old man watching me? Are there more of those? All these things went through my head as I watched him work.
Well, that explains a lot,
he said under his breath. What? What is it? I exclaimed.
Looks like somebody rewired your outlets over here.
He backed away to show me what he was seeing. But why?
My guess? Stealing your power. You sure you didn't notice anything?
His calmness put me on edge. I thought back to the odd noises in my walls, the thumping, the flickering lights. What had once seemed such a normal thing had my heart racing. I noticed a few things here and there, but I haven't been here a lot lately. I thought it was just an old place. He gave me a skeptical look and continued following the ever-expanding bunch of wires and cables throughout the place. Some wires would branch off to more tiny cameras, hidden in vents and just in the shadows. One was even wired into the eye of one of my pictures. How have I not noticed these? My heart had started beating faster and faster as he discovered more. He kept going and, one by one, found all of my electricity had been rewired into one central bunch that led into the bedroom. My heart stopped. How long have these been here?
Not long, I'd say. We check all the appliances and outlets before we rent the places out.
Well, where does it all lead? He kept knocking holes with his hammer and following the dreaded cables until he finally stopped and looked into the most recent hole he made with a flashlight.
The space between the walls gets a lot bigger here. I think I can fit. Hold on. I see something glowing just around the corner.
He smashed a hole big enough for him to squeeze through and disappeared into my bedroom wall. He appeared a few seconds later with a grim look on his face, and his skin had gone pale. He was no longer the calm, apparently fearless man he was before.
You ain't gonna want to hear this, but, there's a little room back there. Bunch of monitors set up all over and all sorts of crap scattered around. Looks like somebody was living in there, but no sign of them now.
He swallowed hard.
This is really starting to freak me the hell out. If I were you, I'd leave.
I packed my things up and left for my parents that day, not wanting to spend another second in that place. Over the next few days, the police came and investigated the whole scene. They found 20 different monitors all linked up to VHS players in that little room in the walls. Surprisingly, though, no tapes were ever found, and neither was whoever it was that had been watching me all those nights. A few weeks had passed and a box arrived on my parents' doorstep. It was unlabeled, but inside was all the little things that had gone missing from my apartment. I also found a dirty, ripped up piece of paper with a barely legible message scrawled on it. I like your new place much better. I walked by him every weekday morning. I pushed through the crowds of the subway station and made my way up the stairs. I could already hear him faintly in the background as I ascended. I would exit onto the street, suffocated by the noise and disorder. It's the heart of downtown. His voice would become louder as I made my way up the street. Most people who work or live downtown would probably recognize him. He always sits unshaven on the corner in old tattered clothing, shouting incoherently. It's gibberish. It's not another language or in a strange accent that he's shouting. It's pure, absolute gibberish. He's most often ignored by those who walk past him. Few even look at him, myself included. He was just some crazy homeless man that shouted insanity. He was part of my commute to work and nothing more. There was the subway cart, the cramped hallway, the walk up the stairs, and of course the bellowing maniac near the entrance. I think back now and there were a few strange things about him. He was always in the same clothing. There was never anyone around him. I never saw him eat or drink. I don't even understand how he could. I'm trying to imagine him entering a grocery store, screaming as usual, and just buying a sandwich. Was there any rhyme or reason to the words he was shouting? Sometimes I wondered. Did those words make any sense to him? Was it us speaking gibberish from his perspective? But that's all he was to me. Just some guy that I would walk past on my way to work. Until 3 days ago, that is. The subway had backed up again and I was in a pretty crappy mood. I could hear him as usual as I made my way up the stairs and stepped outside. I shook my head in frustration. When I walked past the screaming homeless man, I saw there was another man standing in front of him. A businessman. He quietly whispered, "It's a start," before dropping a $50 bill into the container that the shouting homeless man left in front of him. It was the first time I had ever seen any money at all in that container. Waste of money if you ask me, I said quietly under my breath as I walked by. But they both clearly heard me. The homeless man looked up at me and made eye contact, if only for a moment. I saw pain there. The emptiness. But it was just a minor distraction. I simply continued on with my day, thinking little of it. The next morning, things got weirder, though. As I made my way up the subway stairs, I could hear him screaming as usual. But the very moment I stepped outside, it stopped. He had gone completely silent. He was staring at me. His head followed me as I made my way by him. When I got to the end of the block, I looked back. He was still staring at me, expressionless. I turned around the corner heading to work and heard the shouts and gibberish start up again. At this point, I really didn't know what to think. I assumed his shouting was just an act and I had offended him. Now he was trying to make me feel uncomfortable. But that's not what it was. Because that's when the nightmares began. It became much worse than a homeless man trying to make me uncomfortable. It became much worse. That first nightmare was the most real. It began with the sound. I could hear a cacophony all around me. I tried to open my eyes, but they stung and I could barely see through them. It took me a moment to realize that it was blood dripping into my eyes. My blood. My entire body was throbbing with pain. And there was fire. I could feel its heat burning the left side of my body. I remember screaming from the pain and the horror. And then, I found myself sitting up in my bed, sweating and shaking. I didn't know what to make of it. I had never suffered from nightmares before, and it felt real. It felt so goddamn real. But nightmares have a way of fading into the background as the day progresses. By the time I arrived at the subway station downtown, I had mostly forgotten about it. I walked up the stairs again, and could of course hear the screaming homeless man. I stopped at the exit. Would he go silent again when I stepped outside? I slowly raised my leg, and gently stepped outside the door. And silence. He immediately stopped screaming. He was once again staring at me. I shook my head in disbelief. I began the awkward walk past him, thinking that I'll have to start going the long way around the subway station to avoid him. But as I passed him, he spoke to me. Not in gibberish, no. In proper English. What he said stopped me right in my tracks. It scared me far more than I would have been willing to admit at the time. More than I'm willing to admit now. In a clear and concise voice, he said, "If you wipe the blood out of your eyes, you would have seen that you were in hell." I didn't know how to respond to that. What did that mean? How did this insane homeless man know about my dream? Because that's precisely what I remember waking up from. The pain, the blood, the burning, the fire. It was hell. He was right. Was the dream a premonition? Maybe I should have said something to him, asked him for answers. But I didn't. I continued on my way. And that night, I had the same nightmare all over again. But this time it went longer. It began with the sound again. Almost white noise. The blood still in my eyes. The feeling of fire so close to me. But this time I raised my hands and wiped some of the blood out of my eyes. Things slowly became clearer. I was disoriented at first, but eventually figured out that I was hanging upside down, held in place by a seatbelt. There was a passenger beside me. A woman. I didn't recognize her. She looked far worse off than the way I felt. I didn't even think she was alive at all until she opened her eyes and looked at me. I had never seen such pain and anguish in a person's eyes before. She opened her mouth to speak, but began choking immediately. Blood poured out. Given that she was upside down, the blood dripped up her face, into her nose, her eyes, and her hair. She coughed a few times and then made a horrible gurgling sound. She had died. I was certain of it. The car was upside down and another car beside me was on its side. It had caught fire as a result of the accident, and the flame was getting closer. I didn't have much time. I was able to click the seatbelt off, but I fell on my head harder than I thought. It made me dizzy. There was a gash in my chin that was the cause of the blood in my eyes, and I'm pretty sure my left arm was either broken or dislocated. There was no escape outside the driver's side door, So I would need to climb underneath the dead woman to get out the passenger side. And that's when I noticed what was in the back seat. 2 children. Twins, most likely. They were bruised and battered in their car seats, and they were unresponsive. I knew that I was dreaming, but I didn't know what it meant. How could the homeless man know that I had dreamt this? Was this my future? Would I meet a woman, get married, have twins, and then have them die in a horrible car accident? Was this all a punishment? I went into shock. It didn't feel like a dream anymore. It felt like I was really there, living through it. I was trying to imagine how I could possibly move on from a thing like that. Of losing a wife and 2 children in the blink of an eye. I don't remember doing it, but I had made my way outside of the car. A man ran up to me shouting, "Are you all right?" I shook my head and tried to answer him. I wanted to tell him about the woman and the children. I thought of the words in my head. They made sense to me, I just needed to say them. But only gibberish came out. Gibberish. I tried hard to focus on saying the correct words, but I couldn't. I was broken. What had happened in the car had broken me, driven me mad. I was not living this experience. I was a passenger, witnessing it. I looked to the car window and saw my reflection bouncing in the firelight. But it wasn't me. It was the homeless man looking back at me. Maybe a decade or so younger. Blood dripping down his face. Screaming incoherent insanity. I sat up in my bed with a scream. It was morning. It was time for work. I rushed my morning routine and left as quickly as I could. I got to the subway station. I went up the stairs, but I couldn't hear him. I already knew it before I even got outside. He wasn't there. I stood over his usual spot and saw something tucked under a loose brick. It was a photograph. I picked it up and wasn't at all surprised at what I saw. It was a younger version of the homeless man. Beside him was the woman from my dream. His wife. And their 2 children. He had lost them. And it drove him mad. I already knew I would never see him again, but I wanted to. I wanted to tell him how sorry I was. Of how sorry all of us should be. We walk by him, shake our heads, write him off, ignore him. But he was simply a broken man who deserved better from us. I didn't want to go to work yet. I needed to clear my head. I walked up the street, head down, sort of at a loss. I never usually came to these streets and found myself in unfamiliar territory. Eventually, I passed by a woman. She was clearly homeless, and was muttering random words to herself. I approached her and she looked up at me, still ranting incoherently, holding a container in front of her. I slipped a $50 bill into it and whispered, "It's a start." It had been 3 years since my family had last gone on a vacation to Florida, something we did annually before the recession hit. Since we now had enough money, my parents decided, under the popular demand of my sister and I, that we go to Walt Disney World again. We were both teenagers, and our parents kind of saw this as a bit juvenile, but decided it would be fun anyway. I couldn't wait to finally go back, and neither could my sister. Being avid theme park goers as well, we were especially attracted to the creativity and the, well, magic, as one would say about the rides and attractions there. They never got old, and had their share of nostalgia and excitement. However, there was one other reason I wanted to go. People normally associate Disney World with words such as excitement, fun, and happiness, but with these characterizations come counterbalances. After scrolling through OMG Facts one night, I came across a rather interesting story. It was about an abandoned water park in Walt Disney World, apparently named River Country. I was absolutely shocked by this, since I had previously thought of Disney in a more idealistic and perfect way. The water park was directly on the shores of Bay Lake, being that huge, stagnant body of water adjacent to the Magic Kingdom. River Country was, and still is, on the same side as the theme park just mentioned, but right next to a resort called Walt Disney's Fort Wilderness Resort. Surrounding the water park on the resort side is a large green wall, with signs dotting it. These signs read, "Sorry, River Country is closed." The place opened in 1976 and used water from Bay Lake in most of the attractions. It was very rustic and wilderness-based in design, and contained artificial rocks that resembled those used on another well-known ride, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. There was a dam present to keep chunks of dirt and mud from getting into the water too, so guests didn't have to worry about swimming in an artificial bog created by the water from the lake. It was open for 25 years, closing its doors in 2001, and in 2005, a statement released by Disney said that the park would be closed permanently. So, for about 11 years, River Country has been sitting there, abandoned. Nature is in its advanced stages of reclaiming the area, but the slides remain, and so do the artificial rocks, and the small pond, which is now a swamp, that was used for swimming. Many urban explorers have infiltrated the area, jumping over the walls to get footage of the abandoned water park. One of the most controversial things about the park nowadays is why it's closed, which is what I was destined to find out. I wanted to see some real footage of the area before it closed as well, since from what I heard, it was very joyous and bustling with tourists, compared to its ghost town status today. I was without internet at the time, so about 2 days before we were planning to leave, I made my way to the local library, which archived many old videos that people in my community had dug up in their attics, and had donated to the library to be part of a small historical society. Hoping that I might find some good footage, I asked the librarian if they happened to carry any videos dating back to 2001. She nodded, and brought me to a small section containing many old VHS tapes and a few DVDs here and there. After about a half an hour of searching, I came across a tape with the words, "The Old-Fashioned Swimming Hole," inscribed on top of it. This was a term used to describe River Country during its glory days, so I took it, almost certain that it was the footage I was looking for. I asked the librarian if I could sign it out, but she told me that historical videos had to stay in the library. I could, however, watch the video in a small conference room behind the front desk. The librarian led me into a windowless room, and I took a seat in front of the television. She left the room and closed the door so that the audio would not disturb any of the other library patrons. I popped the tape into the VCR under the TV, and turned the lights off so I could see the video better. I was expecting the quality to be low anyway. For about half a minute or so, the screen was gray, and it was accompanied with a loud beeping noise, typical for old VHS tapes. The gray soon disappeared, showing footage of two individuals in front of the entrance to River Country. They were both men, and it was either very late at night or very early in the morning, as nobody else was in the park. Very few of the water park's lights were on either. On the bottom left corner of the screen, the date November 1st, 2001 was displayed. This date was significant because the water park actually closed for good the very next day, on November 2nd. The two men were talking about how they had been denied entrance to the park in the morning, since it had reached its guest capacity limit. They also stated that only at these hours of night could they get past the park security. The two walked up to the bigger water slides in the park, which led directly into the pond, supplied by the green water of Bay Lake. Once they got to the top of the slide, which was encircled by artificial orange rocks, one man prepared to slide down. The two laughed over what seemed to be an inside joke. And finally, the cameraman ended up pushing his friend down the slide. I heard the other man scream in delight as he descended into the pond. The cameraman then proceeded back the way they came to get to the slides, and across a bridge that traversed the small lagoon. He ended up back at the pond shore, where the sound of a splash was heard. This is when things started becoming strange. After waiting at the shore of the pond for a few minutes, nobody surfaced. The cameraman began to call out his friend's name. After another few minutes, the cameraman began to panic and started to run back to get help at the Fort Wilderness Resort. He stopped abruptly at what seemed to be the kiddie area, a small, shallow pond, when he heard a very faint cough. He turned around and saw a barely visible shadow about 10 feet or so behind him. Relieved, the cameraman started to approach his friend, glad that he was okay. But once again, he abruptly halted. The friend's head was hanging down, and he slowly raised it up. The camera began to shake as the features of the other man's face were revealed. Blood was caked around his mouth, and some was dripping off his chin to his feet. He was missing most of the hair on his head as well. However, the most disturbing part was that chunks of skin were missing from the man's head and chest. Upon raising his head fully, you could clearly see that his right eye was hanging by the frayed optic nerve near his cheek. I became severely nauseous at the sight of this, to the point where I was holding back the urge to vomit. My pulse was quickening as fear began to settle within me. As the last minutes of the film approached, the horrendous figure muttered something that sounded like, "There is no hope underneath the water." The shock from hearing this must have triggered the cameraman to run for his life as he began heading in the opposite direction. I wanted to turn the television off and run myself, so I got up and headed for the door. I made it about halfway to the door when I heard a sound. The television was giving off a breathing sound, like that of an old furnace, just in a softer tone. For some reason, this sound kept me from moving. My body was rooted in place, but I was able to turn back and look at the television. The cameraman was still sprinting, but didn't seem to be making any progress. He had ended up back at the large pond where the slide had dumped his friend out. You could hear him sobbing and wheezing softly, fearing for his life. Gradually, the tape began to slow down as the man frantically looked from side to side. The cameraman then turned all the way around and shrieked at the sight of his friend's disfigured face, mere inches away from him. The video froze on this frame, exposing the decaying features all over the other man's face. The top of his skull was now completely exposed, with his right eye now missing. His mouth hung wide open, and coming from it was what looked like a combination of the water from Bay Lake and a dark sludge-like substance. This image stayed on the screen for about 10 seconds, then switched to a black screen, displaying one single message. The epidemic begins today. Instantly, the power on the TV went out, and I was left alone in the darkness of the conference room. I became terrified as I couldn't see a thing, and I couldn't even see the door on the other side of the room either. I began to nervously shake. River Country had closed because of this, and it was obvious. Walt Disney World had been keeping a terrible secret. Suddenly, the librarian opened the door to check in on me, but just before she opened it, I could have sworn I heard breathing coming from the other side of the room, back where the TV was. Last night, I got a text message from my girlfriend V. It said, "Please come over. I want to cuddle." Now, yesterday was a school night and I had an algebra test in the morning. One that I had to pass, in order to not have my phone taken away from me as punishment. At first, I tried to tell her no. But then, She sent those two magical words every teenage boy dreams of hearing from a girl. I'm alone. I won't lie, I jumped off the couch and ran right for the door. I'm 17 years old, and even though I wanted to get a good grade on my upcoming test, I still wanted to spend some alone time with my girlfriend. I probably shouldn't tell you guys this, but I'm also a virgin. So yeah, I was desperate. Anyway, my parents had left earlier for some alone time and took the car with them. That meant I had only two options. Either walk all the way to her house or ride my bike. I chose the latter. It takes less time to ride than walk. Just as I had turned onto the street where her house was, my phone rang. I pulled over off the road and got my phone out of my pocket. The screen glowed in the darkness, and I could see the word "Sir" illuminated in bright, bold letters. I felt my heart skip a beat. It was her father. Her father doesn't like me. Not really. He thinks that V is still a little girl who wears princess dresses and plays with dolls. He's afraid that I'll take her innocence in the back of a pickup truck and then ditch her when she gets pregnant. Not that I'll abandon her. But I digress. I answered the phone. Hello? I asked, hesitantly expecting his gruff, Spanish-accented voice to respond and fire a warning at me to stay away from his only daughter. Instead, her voice did.
Hey, what's up?
She said, and I sighed in relief. Not much, I'm almost at your house, I answered, my feet slowly beginning to pedal again. She laughed, something I didn't expect her to do.
What? What are you doing at my house?
I raised an eyebrow at this. Why? Well, you texted me, I said. The houses lining the streets passed by me as I pedaled faster. From a distance, the roof of her house became visible among the others. Just 50 feet in front of me.
What?
She chuckled again. I said you texted and asked me to come over. Remember? To cuddle? That was just a few minutes ago. How could you forget? This time there was no laugh. Just a moment of silence from her end. It took less than a minute for her voice to come back. By that time, I could see the yard and the driveway of her house.
Did I text you from my phone?
The question caught me off guard. I thought about it, and I remembered that she was calling me from her dad's phone. Yeah? Why? Another moment of silence. It was shorter this time.
Aaron, I'm not at home. I'm out with my folks. I have been for a couple of hours. I don't even have my phone. I left it at home by accident.
She sputtered. I could hear the confusion in her voice. Confusion that I too shared. I was about to ask her to repeat herself when I got another text. It was from her phone again. It said, "Come here. I'm so cold. I want to cuddle." In one of the upstairs windows, I could see someone watching me from behind the curtains. I called the cops, but by the time they got there, the shape in the window had vanished. I'm an avid dreamer. I'm fascinated by the sleeping mind, and as such, I keep a dream journal to catalog every thought that passes through my brain at night. I set at least one alarm every day so that I'm able to wake up during REM sleep and recall my grandest dreams. Sometimes I just go back to sleep, but for the most part, I keep up with it. It's been an enlightening experience, and so far I've filled a couple dozen notebooks. In addition to cataloging my dreams, I also study the phenomenon. I've read almost every book on the subject and watched countless documentaries. In other words, most of my waking life is consumed by sleep, in one form or the other. One day, I visited the local authors section of the town library, in the hopes of finding a book on dreams that I hadn't read yet. This was the one section I had never been in. I expected to find a bunch of self-published romance novels, and for the most part, I did. But there was one nonfiction title that caught my eye. It was called Sleep Tactics: Exercises for a Mind at Rest by Jack Grovewood. The blurb on the back was vague and made it seem like a self-help book with quotes like, "Learn the secrets to a good night's rest," and "Feed your mind's insatiable appetite for better understanding." Not a book on dreams per se, but it did pique my interest. Delving into the book more at home, I found it to be more up my alley than I previously expected. It was filled with chapters pertaining to lucid dreaming, meditation, and even sleepwalking. I was already familiar with most of the content, but it turned out to be an enjoyable read. It wasn't until the last chapter, though, that I was taken completely off guard. I will outline most of it to you now. Chapter 16. How to Exit Your Body. Disclaimer: this is not an OBE, or out-of-body experience. As stated in Chapter 8, Out of Body, Out of Bed, I do believe in OBEs, but I find that they're just another form of dreaming. What I'm about to divulge to you is something completely different. It's neither an OBE nor a dream state. This is a way to truly exit your body using sleep paralysis as a catalyst. Before I discuss specifics, I'd like to go over a few prerequisites. In order to pull this off, you have to be proficient at lucid dreaming. What I mean by this is that you need to have lucid dreams on a regular basis, and retain lucidity for long periods of time in these dreams. It also helps if you're able to manipulate your dream environment while lucid. If you only lucid dream on occasion, you'll have to practice and train your mind to do so more often. See Chapter 6, Becoming a Lucid Lucy. If you, however, are unable to lucid dream and/or have never experienced one before, then this isn't for you. You will not be able to do it, I'm afraid. Another requirement is sleep paralysis. Most of us have experienced this at one time or another, but it will help immensely if you experience it regularly. Coupled with lucidity and a focused mind, sleep paralysis is your only way out of your own skin, so to speak. That's all you need in the way of mental capabilities, more or less. It's an added bonus if you've had an OBE or have even had a wake-initiated lucid dream. Chapter 7. Wake unto sleep. Now on to the fun part. I'm going to lay this out in a step-by-step fashion, followed by a more detailed explanation of what to expect upon achieving your first departure. Keep in mind that results may vary. Step 1. Fall asleep on your back in a slanted position. It could be on a recliner or a car seat, but your body has to be diagonal relative to ground level. That's the only way I've ever been able to get this to work. For one reason or another, gravity plays a role. Step 2. Attain sleep paralysis. This is more of a waiting game than a step, as you can't really execute this at will. You'll just have to keep trying until it happens. When it does happen, lucidity is the key. You have to be aware that you're in a state of sleep paralysis, and be unafraid of your lack of mobility. This is one of the ways being a lucid dreamer comes in handy. Step 3. Once paralyzed, attempt to move your legs. If you're in the proper position, at least one of them should be mobile. If you can't move either of them, then you'll have to start over and experiment by tilting your seat into a different position. Step 4. Upon freeing one or more of your legs, attempt to free your arms next. They should feel incredibly stiff and heavy, and you shouldn't be able to move them, try as you might. You should, however, feel a sharp sting in your head. Don't be alarmed. You are not having an aneurysm. This is completely normal, I assure you, and is necessary to make your exit. Step 5. As difficult and strenuous as it may be, keep trying to move your arms. As you do this, attempt to move the rest of your body as well. Put everything you have into fighting the paralysis. Just don't fall back asleep. Step 6. As you wrestle with your mind and body, the stinging sensation in your head is going to get exponentially worse. It won't cause you pain, but it will create a great discomfort. Let it happen. As the sensation in your brain builds, you'll start to feel yourself drift away from your body. Don't fight it. Your mind is like a rubber band, and it will want to bounce back from where it's being stretched. Don't let it. Follow the flow of departure. If you steal your mind's focus and follow these instructions to a T, you will have successfully exited your earthly meat sack and unlocked a marvel of the mind that has only just begun to be understood. And that's the gist of it. The author went on to say that the world you will find yourself in upon departure will harbor some differences to the one you started in. It will appear similar in almost every way. However, there will be no people there. None at all. On top of that, nothing will budge. Everything remains in its place, as still as can be. After explaining how to re-enter one's body, the author ended the chapter with an eerie warning. Whatever you do, do not go near the water. Needless to say, I was dumbfounded. The entire book up to that point was factual, but the last chapter seemed like something right out of a science fiction novel. It certainly made for an interesting read, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Why have such an out-of-place pseudoscience chapter in an otherwise reputable book? Didn't make any sense to me. About a week passed before I thought about the book again. It was just about time to return it to the library, so I decided to reread it again, namely the last chapter. As absurd as it seemed, I teetered between laughing it off once and for all and actually giving it a shot. I did meet all of the requirements after all, and it would amuse me to some small extent. I could, at the very least, say that I tried it. After much private deliberation, I decided why the hell not. I knew it wasn't going to work, but part of me thought that maybe something would happen. Plus, was there really anything better for me to do during an episode of sleep paralysis? The only minor nuisance was that I'd have to sleep on one of my recliners instead of the comfort of my king-size Serta mattress. But it would only be for one night. After all, I had slept on worse things before. Long story short, I had 3 episodes of sleep paralysis on the night in question. First one, I was too groggy, completely forgot about the book and quickly fell back asleep. The second one lasted a bit longer, and I remembered to try the method. I could just barely move one of my legs, and upon trying the arms, I did feel a small but noticeable discomfort in my head. I wondered for a split second if the method was really leading to something, and then I became a bit excited over it. Because of this, I woke up. Reflecting on what had happened, I became intrigued. I still didn't believe that I could exit my body, but I knew something was going on. I decided to tilt the recliner back a bit and try again. This time I would have better control. The next episode came pretty quick. I hadn't fallen asleep yet, but my body was getting ready to. This is it, I thought. I allowed the paralysis to fully set in before attempting anything. It was difficult not to fall asleep, but I managed. This time around, I was able to fully gain control over my left leg. I moved it back and forth a bit before trying to free my arms. True to the method, they wouldn't budge, and felt oddly stiff, more so than usual. This is when the familiar sting set in. It jarred me, but I kept going. The more I tried to move my arms, the greater the sting grew. Believe it or not, as I continued, I did in fact feel myself drifting away from my body. I tried to keep it up, but my nerves got the better of me. I lost all control for just a moment, and jolted right back into my body, immediately waking up in the process. This experience startled me. It was beginning to seem more and more likely that the last chapter of the book was somehow accurate. My curiosity became aroused to such an extent that I had to tell someone about it. Luckily, I knew just the person. My buddy Josh is a character. He believes in a lot of what I don't. Because of this, we butt heads on a lot of topics. In simple terms, I'm a skeptic and he's a believer. One thing we both share a love for, however, is dreams. He's the only person I can talk to at length about the subject. He also happens to meet the same requirements for departure. I was hoping he could join me in a sleep session and help me get to the bottom of what was happening. I called Josh up and told him everything. He was ecstatic, as I knew he would be. He agreed to meet me the following night at my place for departure. In his mind, this was definitely going to work, but I was still wary. In any case, I was happy to have someone else tag along for the ride. Fast forward to the following night. We hang out for a bit and I show Josh the book. His eyes grow wide upon reading the final chapter and he can't wait to try it out for himself. I told him not to get his hopes up, but it was clear to me that they already were. We laid down at opposite ends of my living room on my 2 recliners. Josh cracked a joke about how this was the first night we'd be sleeping together. I threw a pillow at him, and then we were off. Shut-eye was right around the corner. This is when things get weird. I didn't have an episode of sleep paralysis right away, but I did end up waking a few hours into my nap. I noticed that Josh was fast asleep in the recliner across the room. Having to empty my bladder, I walked past him to get to the bathroom, tripping over his legs in the process. I met the floor with a thud and turned around to see if Josh had woken up. He hadn't. I knew he was a heavy sleeper, but even he should have woken up given the commotion. Worried, I yelled his name. Nothing. I tried shaking him. Still nothing. I grabbed his wrist and checked his pulse. It was there, but it was faint. This is when I panicked. I ran to my room, grabbed my phone, and scrambled to hit the call button. Just as I was about to dial 911, I heard a loud gasp from the next room, like a diver coming up for air. I ran out to the living room, and to my relief, Josh was awake. He looked up at me with wide eyes and said, Dude, it worked." I was flabbergasted. Though Josh was an overenthusiastic believer and downright stubborn at times, he was no liar. I asked him over and over again if he was sure it wasn't just a dream, and he said he was 100% certain. I believed him. Why else would I not have been able to wake him? Why else would his pulse have been so weak? We spent the next couple of hours talking about the experience. Josh told me the author was right. Upon leaving his body, he found himself in the world around him. Only everything was perfectly still. He tried opening the door to my house, but the knob wouldn't turn, and the door wouldn't budge. It took him a while to realize this, but he ended up discovering that he could actually phase through walls. This is one of the reasons that caused me to think it might have been a dream. Josh went on to tell me that the world looked different as well. He said it was like having the contrast dialed up on a picture, combined with the eerie stillness. He said it truly was like being stuck in a photograph. I tried to imagine it, but I knew I needed to see it for myself. We made plans to go back to sleep and enter the world together. Though I was anxious, I felt confident I could pull it off this time. And I did. I made my first successful departure that night, and found Josh waiting in the room for me, next to his sleeping body. While seeing ourselves sleeping was fascinating in itself, I wanted more than anything to see the world outside. For a few weeks, Josh slept over at my house, and we explored the new world together. It was fun and downright addicting. Curiosity was what kept us going. We wanted to know more about the odd realm we had found ourselves in. Here are just a few things we learned. The lighting is fixed. It always looks to be about noontime, though there's no sun in the sky. We can't phase through older buildings. Not sure why. There's no people, like the book said, but also no animals or even insects. Sound is reverbed. There's always a slight echo when Josh and I talk. It's possible to fall asleep in that world, but you don't dream. If you travel too far away from your body, you'll hit an invisible wall and be unable to go any further. Time doesn't pass in the real world while we're departed. After about a month of exploring, things changed. The more and more we explored, the more uncomfortable I felt. It always seems like something had its eye on us, even though there was no one around. Josh was the opposite. Our late-night adventures were becoming so routine for him that he was becoming bored. He kept talking about the water and how he wanted to get a closer look at the pond near the main road. I kept reminding him about the author's warning, but Josh didn't seem to care. Water was the one thing we hadn't messed around with yet. Eventually, Josh's curiosity got the better of him. One night, upon leaving my body, Josh was nowhere to be found. I thought that maybe he hadn't departed yet, but he always seemed to beat me to the punch. This could only mean one thing. I phased through the walls of my house and raced to the nearby pond. Josh was there. He was standing at the end of the dock that the locals would fish off of. I yelled out to him, "Josh, what are you doing?" "It's fine, see? There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just water." I watched as Josh reached out and touched the surface of the pond. It rippled. This struck me as incredibly bizarre. It shouldn't have reacted to his touch. We had been there for weeks and hadn't seen a single thing move. Even the air was still. Perplexed, I started walking out towards Josh. He lifted his hand up just as awestruck as I was. As he pulled his arm back, the ripple expanded. With it, a small portion of the water turned black. After a few moments, I watched as something reached out from the blackness. It was a hand. It reached up over the dock and grabbed Josh's leg, yanking him downward. He went feet first into the water, holding onto the dock for dear life. As he screamed, I ran towards him as fast as I could. Before I could even get halfway to his position, I watched him disappear into the water. I ran the rest of the way, but the blackness had faded, and the water returned to normal. My best friend was gone. Breathless and in shock, I ran away. I wanted to save Josh, but I didn't know how. I also felt that if I re-entered my body, perhaps I would find Josh, awake in the real world. It was wishful thinking, but it was all I had. That wishful thinking fell flat when I awoke. Josh was still unconscious. I tried and tried, but I couldn't get him to wake up. Eventually, I called 911 and he was taken away on a stretcher. The doctors say he's in a coma, but can't discern what caused it. And that's everything. I'm a complete wreck over what happened. I've tried visiting Josh in the hospital, but I can't face his parents, and they're always there. Instead, I go out to the pond, in the real world, hoping somehow I'll find some answers. All I do end up finding are just more questions. I haven't even departed since Josh was taken. I've tried, but something's holding me back. It might be fear. Josh's analogy was right. The world is like a photograph, a still frame of the world we were never meant to see, a moment frozen in time with a layer of reality stripped away. And there's something living there. Despite this, I need to save my friend. He didn't heed the author's warning, but I'm the reason he entered that world in the first place. I have to go back.